Construction activity reported its biggest improvement in 1.5 years, but work remains scarce, and as a result, tendering competition remained fierce and profitability subdued. Although the civil construction index increased from 21 to 26 basis points, a reading of 26 indicates that 75% of respondents remain dissatisfied with prevailing business conditions. Cees Bruggemans, chief economist at FNB, joins us to unpack the numbers further. Thanks so much, Cees, for joining us today. So, according to the survey, as I've said, we've started to see the construction recovery accelerate, activity recording its biggest improvement that we've seen in the past 1.5 years. Encouraging, it seems. One has to ask the question, though, to what extent?
Well, any recovery starts very low, and the construction industry is no different given what we have seen the last 2-3 years. And given the pronounced pessimism that we've had in recent times, one can easily emphasize that only 26% of the respondents express confidence and that 3/4 still are dissatisfied with what is taking place. The fierce tendering competition, the subdued profitability, employment either still falling or at most moving sideways at low levels. Compared to saying, yes, but if you actually look at activity levels, you do see a noticeable recovery starting to take place. And there is reason to suppose that this will actually sustain itself. In other words, if we come a year from now, 2 years from now, we look back, we will see a cyclical recovery in place. So the emphasis today on this fourth quarter result is very much the good news, bad news story. That yes, it starts from a very low level, and therefore a business as such is still described in poor terms, but there has been a very noticeable improvement in activity levels, and I think that needs to be emphasized, for which reason we have put out the media release in the way we have done.
Having said that, a very interesting point that stood out in this report is that the 5 index point increase that we saw only cancelled the losses of the previous year and brought confidence back to the same levels that we saw a year ago.
In other words, we've had a very long, prolonged bottom or trough in this particular cycle. It has not been sharp down and then sharp up at all. It has been very substantially down and then staying down. And what we're now signaling is that yes, here is a comeback that is starting to take place, and one can see it in various areas.
Let's take a look at some of the areas, because we've got obviously eye on public corporations, then government, and then private sector as well. So where's that recovery a little bit more pronounced, and where's it still waning?
Well, in the public corporations, Transnet is very busy on that pipeline, has been busy on that pipeline. And of course, last week announced the Swaziland railway line that it wants to do. That is specifically an example of activity levels ultimately lifting. And while when you get to Eskom, the construction activity tends to be upfront. So the large Eskom activity is probably the fixed investment taking place is now shifting more to machinery and equipment rather than being noticed in the construction industry. When it comes to provincial, local government, there are road and water projects underway. And there is tender activity, contracts being awarded, and this is something that one should take note of, despite the fact about the poor finances, specifically of certain municipalities. Yeah. And then in the private sector, it is primarily the mining sector, keeping mining capacity sustainable. But the point is that these activities are taking place, and when you add it all up, we are seeing higher activity levels than what we have seen for some time.
When it comes to the provincial and government, local government expenditure side of things, how are you rating political will at this stage?
I wouldn't want to rate it. It is not my job to do so. We merely are responding to what people in this survey are telling us. And what we're picking up is that there is more tendering, there is more contracts being allocated. So despite all the problems that we know about, by inference, I would not just want to then write out the potential, because what we're seeing taking place in terms of these surveys is that people are actually registering and noting and enjoying higher activity levels. So there is something out there that is stirring.
Do we have to differentiate between the various contractors, so your smaller players versus those that operate on a national or regional level?
Yes, although I don't have that kind of detail for you, because I don't have that breakdown in terms of the survey, and it is wise to do so. My sense from the industry is that the activity levels are starting to improve on a wider scale.
Okay, taking a look at the employment side of things, you say employment falling on the construction front. I mean, we had the Fitch outlook on a downgrade to South Africa coming through to negative on Friday, and a large component of that was based on structural concerns and the lack of South Africa addressing these problems. One of those major factors was unemployment, sitting at 25%. What are you making of the kind of strides we're seeing in that regard? Is it still disappointing?
We're now out of construction into the broader economy. And there's certainly...
But within the construction space specifically?
Well, the construction area has been one of the poorer performers over the last 2-3 years. And you have therefore had a substantial contraction in employment levels over the past 2 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, it has been really pronounced. But that contraction, that decline is basically ending if it hasn't already ended. In terms of the survey, we still picked up that people emphasized retrenching, but at a much slower pace than before. Generally, the impression is that, in fact, employment levels are starting to move sideways, and this is at low levels. So if it is true that tendering and contract awards are improving or starting to improve from low levels, then as the activity picks up, I would expect that to become reflected in employment levels. It is a matter of time.
Yeah, so that's the way we left off and wrapped up last year, 2011, moving into 2012. What's the outlook looking like?
I would therefore expect that when we get to the end of 2012, looking back, that we have seen these tendencies of late 2011 to have strengthened, and for there to be a more pronounced cyclical recovery. Saying a more pronounced cyclical recovery, I do not mean a very steep improvement in activity levels, but nevertheless a steady improvement in the various markets that you have referred to. We seem to be leaving the bottom of the cycle behind us.